The Seven Forms of Sin Monastery, Zimar, Taldor, mid-autumn 4718. The party had been on the hunt for Diyanah's kidnapped brothers and their families. The trail had led them to a secret monastery under the city of Zimar, used to ready acolytes for their transition into the way of the Rakshasa. Helping Diyanah in this quest were his close friends and allies, Aurelius, Marius, Demi, and Rankle, along with his trusty lion, Raja. Also accompanying them was Jenny the Rakshasa, a crocodile-headed woman, still under the influence of a charm spell that Demi had placed on her back at Waterhill Manor. Jenny had led them down a secret tunnel, leading from a cesspool up and around a narrow, curved passage, culminating in what appeared to be a door, but which Jenny explained was actually the back of a bookcase. "The bookcase opens into a library," she said. "And honestly, you'll be really lucky if it's empty. I would bet money that Quan Dismal is there. You'll recognize her because she's an elf. She's our most promising acolyte, and a pretty skilled monk of the Seven Form style, but she's such a nerd." Diyanah cracked his knuckles. "Well, Seven Forms has got nothing on the dragon style," and he pushed open the bookcase. The hidden door swung open, revealing a dimly lit library of scrolls and books tucked away in this corner of the monastery. Shelves lined the stone walls, and the air carried a faint scent of parchment and incense. At the center of the room sat a round table, surrounded by figures. An elven woman in monk's robes was engrossed in a tome, her fingers trailing across the text. Beside her, two other monks were also reading prescribed texts, though their eyes snapped up as the party entered. Near the far wall, guarding a reinforced door, stood two Rakshasa in their true forms, hulking humanoid figures with lupine heads, one black-furred, the other reddish. In each of their twisted claws they gripped curved kukris. Here in the Seven Forms of Sin Monastery, the Rakshasas were not hiding their true shape. Aurelius was suddenly glad he had saved up his last haste spell. He magically quickened his allies, who were then further bolstered by Demi's battle song. In the four, Diyanah and Raja charged into the room. They were quickly followed by Marius and Rankle. Demi and Aurelius kept to the rear. All the while, Jenny just watched and made glib commentary as per usual. Their foes were quick on their feet too. The elven monk that must have been called Quan was on her feet in a flash, a gleaming scimitar in her hand. The other two monks were a little slower on the draw, but were armed before Diyanah and Raja had reached them. Unlike Diyanah, who used the elemental-powered dragon style and his bare fists to do his fighting for him, the monks of the Seven Styles favored rapid slashing attacks with light blades. Behind the monks, the two lupine Rakshasas were working away around the central fray to engage Marius and Rankle, respectively. The elf Quan moved with unnerving speed, her blade flashing in deadly arcs. Diyanah evaded her strikes, allowing her momentum to unbalance her, so he could come in for a rapid counterattack. His fist, charged with crackling flames, connected with a solid blow, scorching her robes on impact. Raja pounced on one of the lesser monks, his massive paws slamming the man to the ground. The monk twisted and kicked, but the dire lion's jaws snapped shut with bone-crushing force. Marius, shield and blade at the ready, intercepted the black-furred Rakshasa. The creature slashed with its kukri, but Marius's shield absorbed the blow with a resounding clang. He retaliated with a precise strike of Coriana's blade, his strength overwhelming the creature's defenses. Rankle darted in like a shadow, slipping past Marius to engage the reddish-furred Rakshasa, his own twin scimitars flashing in rapid succession. The Rakshasa snarled, trying to counter with his kukri, but Rankle's agility kept him one step ahead. In the rear, Aurelius peppered the enemies with strikes from his wand of magic missile. A shimmering force missile struck one of the monks, knocking him off balance, while Demi fired a bolt from Dignity's barb, piercing through the chaos to strike Quan in the shoulder. Quan snarled in pain, her eyes locking onto Demi. "You'll pay for that, bard," she spat, darting towards her with unnatural speed. Before she could reach Demi, Diyanah intercepted her, his foot sweeping low in a powerful kick that sent her sprawling. "Learned that trick from Marius," he said, his stance unyielding. The battle raged on, the room a blur of steel and claws. The monks of the Seven Forms fought with precision and grace, but the party's teamwork and raw power soon overwhelmed them. Raja's ferocity, Diyanah's precision, Marius's resilience, Rankle's cunning, and the unyielding support of Demi and Aurelius proved too much for the Rakshasa and their acolytes. As the last of the enemies fell, the library grew silent once more, save for the labored breathing of the victorious heroes. Jenny clapped mockingly from her perch by the door. "Bravo," she said. "Truly inspiring. What a tragedy that Quan had to die before she could attempt her ascension ritual. A real pity. I think your family is being kept beyond that door." Diyanah threw open the door, his heart pounding as he stepped into the dimly lit chamber. Relief flooded him as he saw familiar faces. His older brother Vespero, Vespero's wife Miralia, and their daughter Valeria, and Volto's wife Xenia, with their 2 children Pietro and Paeonia. They were huddled together, their expressions a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Yet, even as his eyes scanned the room, one face was missing. Where was Volto? "Diyanah!" Valeria cried, rushing forward to embrace him. The others stirred at the sound of her voice. "You found us," Miralia said in a kind of amazement, standing in and moving towards him, her demeanor more composed than the others, whose grief and fatigue were written plainly on their faces. "What happened here?" Diyanah asked urgently, his eyes darting between all of them. "Where's Volto?" Miralia hesitated, her lips pressed into a tight line. She glanced at Vespero, who sat slumped against the wall, a flask of something strong in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his expression hollow. "They did something to him, didn't they?" Diyanah pressed, his voice trembling slightly. Miralia nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. "The Rakshasas killed him. It could have been on Grand Duke Vobilar's orders, or it might have been just for their amusement. I don't know which." The words hit Diyanah like a blow. He staggered slightly, his breath catching. "Volto's dead," he whispered. Vespero suddenly stood, his movement unsteady but his anger sharp and clear. "You promised us, Diyanah," he said, his voice rising. "You swore that aligning with the Princess Eutropia would bring no harm to our family, that this was about changing Taldor for the better. But look at what it's cost us. Volto is dead because of this." Diyanah began, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? Vespero wasn't wrong. Xenia, Volto's widow, let out a choked sob from where she sat with her children. Paeonia clung to her mother, her face buried in Xenia's lap, while Pietro stared at Diyanah, his young face twisted in confusion and pain. "You should never have dragged us into this," Vespero continued bitterly. "Volto didn't care about your politics. He just wanted to keep his family safe, and now he's gone." "I didn't mean for this to happen," Diyanah said, his voice shaking. "I told you to distance yourself from me if there was any blowback in the south." "Distance ourselves from the princess's champion," Vespero spat, throwing his flask to the ground. It shattered, the sharp scent of alcohol filling the room. "Impossible, Diyanah. Volto paid the price for your arrogance." "Vespero, you are drunk," Miralia said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't helping." Vespero turned away, his shoulders heaving as he tried to steady himself. Miralia stepped closer to Diyanah, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "This isn't your fault," she said softly, though her eyes were heavy with grief. Before Diyanah could respond, Rankle's voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "I hate to break up this complicated reunion," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But there are definitely more Rakshasa and monk trainees somewhere in this monastery. We have to get out of here, and your brother looks too drunk to walk." Diyanah turned to Vespero, whose expression was sullen, his posture slumped with the weight of both guilt and inebriation. "I think I can fix that," Demi interjected, stepping forward with a reassuring smile. She began to sing, her voice soft and melodious, weaving a soothing tune that resonated in the air. As she sang, the fatigue seemed to drain from Vespero's face. His bloodshot eyes cleared, his pallor brightened, and the stench of stale alcohol seemed to dissipate entirely. Vespero blinked rapidly, staring down at the shattered flask near his feet. "Diyanah, I'm so sorry for my outburst," he stammered, his words heavy with shame. "Don't worry about it," Diyanah said, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "You've been through a lot. We'll talk about this, but not here. Not now." As if on cue, the sound of raised voices echoed down the hallway outside. Diyanah's gaze snapped to the door, just as Rankle drew his blade. "We've got company," Rankle said tersely. "Looks like 2 more Rakshasa and 4 monks." The Cavern elf turned to Vespero sharply. "You know how to fight?" Vespero straightened, his stance more confident now that the effects of Demi's song had fully restored him. "Of course I do," he said, his voice suddenly carrying a trace of his old swagger. "I'm a Frascati, and I'm a swashbuckler." Rankle didn't hesitate. He tossed Vespero the sky metal blade he'd been carrying. Vespero caught it deftly, a look of surprise crossing his face as he tested its weight and balance with a quick flourish. "I've never felt its equal," Vespero said, with a glint of excitement returning to his eyes. He raised the blade, falling into a practiced stance. "In guardia!" The door burst open and the fight began. The Rakshasa entered first, their animalistic heads bearing teeth in vicious snarls, followed closely by the monks with blades drawn and movements honed. Diyanah and Vespero stood shoulder to shoulder, a striking pair. Diyanah moved with the raw explosive power of the Auroran dragon style. Vespero, meanwhile, was a vision of elegance and precision, his refined Taldan fencing technique a perfect counterpoint to Diyanah's primal ferocity. Then the room erupted into chaos. Raja leapt into the fray, his massive paws slamming one of the monks to the ground again. Rankle darted through the melee, his flaming scimitar flashing in and out like a flickering candle, while Demi's battle song, swelling to a crescendo, bolstered her allies with each note. Diyanah spun, his fist crackling with elemental energy as he struck a monk square in the chest, sending the man sprawling. Beside him, Vespero's blade moved like a thing alive, parrying a monk's slash before driving the sky metal tip home with a flourish. For a moment, in the heart of the chaos, the brothers locked eyes. "Not bad for a monk," Vespero quipped, his grin suddenly boyish and bright. "Not bad for a drunkard," Diyanah shot back, his own grin tugging at the corner of his lips. With their combined strength, the party quickly gained the upper hand. As the dust settled, Vespero lowered his blade, panting but victorious. "Nice work. I think Volta would be proud of you," Diyanah said quietly. Vespero's expression seemed to soften, but the weight of their loss settled between them once more. Too early to play that card, Diyanah. Let's get out of here." Even as he said this, he could hear more footsteps coming from further down the complex. Thankfully, the library was something of a dead end, so Rankle turned the band of Crusaders' Alliance to the onyx face and conjured a wall of stone to block off the only exit besides the secret one. "That should buy us some time," he said. It was only then that Vespero realized that one of the Rakshasa was among them. Diyanah also realized this and leaned in. "She's charmed," he said quickly. "Don't raise a stink. We don't want to do anything that might break the spell." Vespero kept quiet, but it was clear he was fuming. "Jenny, is there another exit to the sewers?" asked Demi. "Some way back out that doesn't require us to go all the way back to the Vobilar residence." "Of course. We'll go back down to the sewers, and I can get you to a discreet street entrance that gets us into the Pike District." Demi frowned. "Isn't that where the garrison is? The place will be swarming with soldiers." "It's the closest exit," complained Jenny. "That's what you asked for. Anyway, Pike District is more than the old garrison. It has a bunch of taverns, and it's super gentrified now. Many middle-class families live in the Pike District, particularly those with a long Taldan pedigree who like the idea of living in the most historically Taldan district of the city. My path will get us out near a tavern in a very residential area. What more could you ask for?" Demi considered this and finally said, "Fine, lead on, Jenny." They followed Jenny down some branching paths of the catacomb before reaching the cellar of the tavern. Diyanah turned Raja back into a figurine, and Jenny took a moment to shift her face back to human, and then she kicked open a pair of hatchway doors that opened into a mostly empty street. "A perfect exit. Now that we've rescued your friend's family, what's next on our heroic adventure?" And then Demi suddenly realized she didn't know what to do with Jenny now that their mission was over. After taking a minute to think it over, Demi put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Jenny, you've been a real pal, and I'd say a real hero today. You helped us rescue Diyanah's family, and that's no small feat." "Yeah, you couldn't have done it without me," she said, beaming with what looked like genuine pride. "I always heard it said that it felt good to be a hero, and I never knew why until now." "Right," said Demi, "but unfortunately, the next bit of our quest is boring. We have to get Diyanah's family to safety. But you, Jenny, you could help us with our next problem. The real villain of this story is Grand Duke Vobilar. If you can track him down, we can fight him together in the future." "Yeah, that totally makes sense," said Jenny, putting on her thinking face. "Okay, very well. Let's see if I can track him down. Find me when you're back in Zamar." Then the psychopathic crocodile lady was off, skipping down the streets of the Pikes District with a song in her heart and a mission on her mind. The party breathed a sigh of relief when she rounded a corner and was out of eyeline. "How do we get everyone to safety?" asked Diyanah of Aurelius. "I don't know, Diyanah," said the wizard. "This was way more difficult than I thought it was going to be, and I've burned through all of my spells, except for the teleport spell I was saving to get us back to Kreeris. But teleport only allows me to bring myself plus 4 additional people with me. There's 5 of us and 6 members of your family. That's 11 people total. I don't know how we're getting us out of Sofra, never mind out of the city with all their guards and checkpoints." "Well, good thing you accidentally pulled me in," said Rankle, "because I can get everyone out of the city, I think. Are you familiar with a divine spell called Windwalk?" Aurelius shook his head in the negative. He was less familiar with divine magic. "What's the Windwalk spell?" asked Diyanah. "It's not unlike teleport. It's a good spell to get around. It can affect me and up to 5 creatures. But unlike Aurelius, I'm not tapped out of magic. I can cast it twice today." He looked around. "So affecting everyone except for one person. Maybe Aurelius should still teleport." Might not be needed, noted Demi. Thanks to my new eagle cloak, I can turn into a bird now and make my own way out of the city. Rankle nodded. Right, I forgot about that. Anyway, once I cast the spell, everyone affected can adopt a gaseous form, just like the gaseous form spell. In gaseous form, everyone can fly slowly, but while the wind walk spell is active, I can also summon a magical wind to convey us up to about 60 miles an hour. Wow, said Marius, impressed. Very useful. How long does this spell last? About 12 hours. It won't get us as far as Aurelius' teleport, but we should easily be able to land somewhere safe. Now that we've got Diyanah's family and a way to move around quickly, thought Aurelius out loud, we might consider going back to my old home. The Bettanos Keep was raised by Pytherius long ago, but even so, we have thick stone walls, and it might still be highly defensible. Orc squatters seem to have moved in, but we can probably deal with them, right? Marius frowned slightly, so Aurelius added, or reason with them? Marius' expression eased slightly, and then Aurelius continued. Either way, ever since I had a vision of my father in the Serenite tomb, I can't help but feel there's something I'm missing. I need to go there before we head back to Kreris. We can't leave the front undefended indefinitely, said Rankle. We won't, said Aurelius. Plus, my teleport spell is still available to me. If someone from camp urgently reaches us with a sending spell, the 5 of us can still get back in a moment's notice, albeit all out of spells and resources, which isn't great. Yeah, all right, fair enough, said Rankle. Then it's a reasonable request. How do we get to the Bettanos Keep? I know the way, said Demi. You turn everyone into cloud people and follow me. Demi activated her magic cloak as she leapt into the air and was replaced by a white-feathered eagle, beating its wings and rising ever higher into the sky. Hang on, said Rankle to everyone, and hold on to the children. This may scare them a little. As Rankle's magic settled on everyone, suddenly everyone started to dissolve, and sure enough, the kids were freaking out a little. He didn't give them a chance to make too much noise, though. As they began to take the shape of humanoid clouds, he picked up a powerful wind, and he was suddenly accelerating towards the White Eagle, following Demi to the Bettanos Keep. Old Bettanos Keep, Tuscalia County, Sofra Prefecture, Taldor, 4718. It only took the party an hour to fly to the point where they could make out the Bettanos Keep on the horizon. The children had stopped worrying only about 10 minutes into their journey, basically as soon as they realized they wouldn't dissolve further from their wispy cloud state, and that they could still talk to each other. Plus, the unique vantage point Rankle was giving them over the land, and the speed with which they flew, actually made them kind of excited. Aurelius looked to his old family castle. Despite having been razed 15 years ago, the stonework had held, and the once blackened Bettanos lands had long since returned to green. In fact, the keep itself was now overgrown with ivy and vines, and the gardens that had once been gated around the keep were wild with weeds and untended blooms. When they reached the point where they could drop down into the gated area, they could see that 2 half-orc guards were patrolling outside. Demi silenced the group with a silent table spell, just to make sure the children didn't alert the guards below. Keeping high enough in the sky, they could pass for a cluster of clouds, and the group discussed what to do. Think you could drop down and save us another fight today? Asked Aurelius of Marius. Sure, said Marius. I can give it a shot. Marius floated down behind a tree and reconstituted to solid form. He stepped out loudly, as if making no effort to hide himself, making sure he appeared to be coming from the gate. The half-orc guards looked up, and for a second they looked as if they might raise weapons, but after seeing Marius's green skin, they lowered them slightly. As Marius approached, the 2 half-orc guards studied him with wary curiosity. Their hands rested on their weapons, but they didn't seem hostile, yet. You come here looking for Orgloom's camp, one of them barked in Orcish, his tone gruff but his question earnest. It had been a while since Marius had heard anyone speak in Orcish, and honestly, he worried his own command of the tongue would be a little rusty, since he basically never spoke it to anyone anymore. However, it was his first language, and he had grown up among the half-orc travelers of the White Marches. So when the 2 half-orcs spoke to him in the familiar, slightly nasal pitch of his kinsfolk, he realized these were not from Sofra Prefecture. There was another thing that Marius realized that he recognized, the name Orgloom. When Marius was a young boy, his father Akrod and their clan used to wander the length and breadth of the White Marches, the stretch of territory for which the prefecture of White March was named. The White Marches were hill country that hugged the southern range mountains. His people were not technically Taldan nationals. They recognized no human borders. They brought their trade from as far north as the small town of Tribulation, which could be found in the northern end of the Southern Range Mountains and on the far side of the Emperor's Pass, all the way down to the White March capital of Pol, across the Headwater Gap and down to Lion's Guard, and sometimes heading as far south as Omash and Gazbilla and Kadeera. They would also stop at a number of orc cities as well that were rarely marked on Taldan maps. These tended to be quite high up in elevation in the White Marches, frontier lands close to the mountains, where Taldan rangers were wary to go. When they would go to such places, Marius's father was always careful to warn Marius not to pick fights with the orcs. They were not so gentle as the Dromar travelers. The Dromar being the orc word for half-orcs, it had a slightly different meaning in their tongue. Half-orc, the Taldan word, signified one who was not fully human, but Dromar was a modified version of the word for a war drummer, referring to how the mixed children of orcs and humans often possess skills that many orcs struggled with, particularly artisan skills or bardic skills. In any case, most orc villages had a number of Dromar living among them, and Marius's father's clan of half-orc travelers preferred to leave their children among the village's Dromar, for fear of them getting into fights with the larger orc children. Taldor was a predominantly human land, and its few wild places really clung to the extremities of the empire. As such, most orc villages had substantial Dromar communities. In fact, in Marius's memory, there was only ever one village they had stopped at that was truly an orc city, almost entirely populated by full-blood orcs, and it was the orc city of Drushvuk, located just north of the White Pass in the southern range, right along the border between Kadeera and Taldor. The war chief of Drushvuk was a great bear of an orc named Orgloom the Bloody-Handed. Marius had only seen him once that he could recall, when he was quite young, and yet the great size of him had remained permanently in his memory. "You come here looking for Orgloom's camp?" came the question again. "You mean Orgloom the Bloody-Handed?" asked Marius, war chief of Drushvuk. "Yes, of course," said the Dromar guard. "Wait, you don't know?" "Don't know what?" asked Marius. The other one spoke up. "Well, we figured from your accent that you were from White March, but based on your fancy moustache, I guess you've been in Taldor for some time." Marius laughed. "Yeah, you could say that. I've been away from home for a long time. I'm out of touch. Name's Marius. Was passing through and saw the keep. Thought I'd stop by and see who's taken up residence." He kept his tone casual, his body language non-threatening. "Well then, I'm sorry to tell you Drushvuk's been destroyed, as have pretty much all the other orc holds between Drushvuk and the Headwater Gap." Some things were clicking together in Marius's head, because Pytherius came through White March to secure it, and stop the Grand Duchess from claiming for Eutropia. "I don't know about all that human politicking," said the guard that had been doing most of the talking. "But yes, a big army came through, and they began sacking all the orc villages." "Why the orc villages?" said Marius, confused. "We're not involved with Taldor politics at all." "Labor," said the other Dromar. "Any army of considerable size requires resources to operate, be it equipment, fodder, water, or food. That stupid human was marching almost 2,000 soldiers up around the Whistling Plains. Who was going to carry all their supplies?" A hot, angry light flashed in Marius's eyes. "They're making slaves of orcs and Dromar," he said. The first Dromar guard laughed. "They're humans, so they wouldn't call it that. Forced labor conscription, on account of a state of emergency, or some such nonsense. But yes, mind you, it's mostly Dromar that were conscripted to provide camp labor. Full-blood orcs were mostly put to death for being too unruly. Not sure which fate is worse myself, to be honest. Some of us tried to fight, but his army was too well equipped, too well trained. They have drakes too. It was butchery, plain and simple. So some of us fled here." "So the army came closing in from the west, and you somehow made it further west?" asked Marius curiously. "What were we going to do? Head east into the Moraz Desert? That way is death. Death and Kelishite hunters." "What about Orgloom?" asked Marius. "Orgloom was the last orc standing at Drushvuk. He probably did Princess Eutropia a huge favor by killing so many humans, but he knew when the day was lost. Orgloom is an old bastard. He still knows the old ways. He's friends with the Enshrak, and they know the secret paths to the Darklands. So Orgloom gathered up what survivors he could, and he led them west, deeper into Taldor." Marius nodded at this. He was familiar with the Enshrak tribe. At one point in time, all orcs were cave dwellers and lived in the Darklands, but today only the Enshract kept the old ways and lived beneath the surface of the world. He had never met one.
Orgloom led us here a while ago now, the second half-orc said. Place was abandoned. Looked like it'd been through hell. We cleaned it up the best we could. We're just looking for shelter from the elements. Orgloom doesn't see this as a permanent home.
Marius crossed his arms. Well, my friends and I could use shelter for the night. Maybe more than one night. We might have a proposition for you. The first guard raised an eyebrow. A proposition? Marius nodded, lowering his voice slightly to draw them in. Sounds like you know all about Taldor's civil troubles. My friends are on Eutropia's side, living in Pytherius lands. We need a safe place to rest, and this keep's defenses could make it a good spot for anyone looking to stay out of the mess. We'd be happy to work something out with you and yours. Maybe make it safer for everyone.
How many of you are there?
Asked the second guard, shifting uncomfortably and looking around for who Marius's friends might be. Well, some of us, like myself, are just passing through. Some of us are women and children. Human aristocrats, actually. They'd owe you a debt. They're from a nearby vineyard that got raided. There's also a wagon in the woodlands west of here with some of their field hands. No more than 12 in all. But good people.
Oh, that may be, but that's a lot of mouths to feed, said the first guard.
Before Marius could respond, Demi's white eagle form descended in a slow, graceful glide, landing nearby. She transformed back into her humanoid self, in a shimmer of feathers and magic, offering the guards a disarming smile. Greetings! Demi, Marius was not surprised to discover, spoke fluent Orcish, although her accent marked her as someone who had learned the language from the northern orcs of the Fog Peaks. I hope I haven't startled you. The workers coming from the vineyard can bring supplies and have some useful skills to offer in return for a brief stay. Perhaps we can talk to War Chief Orgloom. The guards, whose hackles had raised momentarily, relaxed slightly at Demi's calm demeanor. All right, we'll see what we can do, the first one said after a moment, and Marius couldn't believe how Demi's curious manner seemed to always work, regardless of whether she was talking to the noblest lords in Taldor or the toughest orcs in the White Marches. Just the two of you for now, though, said the first guard. The second guard was looking around the sky for any other eagles, but not seeing any. He didn't notice the cluster of curious human-shaped clouds floating a little ways overhead. As they walked in, Marius muttered something under his breath to Demi. Remember how I got annoyed at Aurelius when he asked if the squatters were friends of mine, and I was all like, "Hey, we don't all know each other," to which Demi nodded politely. Yes, I know, it's quite funny. You do know these orcs, don't you? I speak fluent Orcish, and I've been listening to the entire conversation. When we get to Orgloom, I will let you do the talking, but Marius, a few things occur to me. First, this is an orc that may respond to a more orcish approach than you may have grown comfortable with. And second, that this is an orc that might want revenge against Pytherius, just as much as we do. Yeah, thanks for the tips, said Marius. As Marius and Demi followed the Dromar guard through the ground floor of the Bettanos Keep, the disrepair of the once grand castle became apparent. The walls were creeping with ivy, and the floors were cracked and dirty. Still, there were traces of life here. The hearth had been repaired, and even extended, making it into a communal fire pit for the Dromar community here. Makeshift furniture had been assembled, and the clusters of bedrolls suggested a modest but organized encampment. The guard led them to what had once been the great hall. Now the towering doors stood ajar, their faded bas-relief of the Bettanos family crest barely visible beneath the grime. Inside, the high-vaulted room had been repurposed as a gathering space. Several Dromar moved about, sharpening weapons, patching armor, and preparing meals, and the occasional full-blood orc was scattered among them. At the center of the hall, seated with his back turned to them, gazing at the fire blazing in the hearth, was a figure Marius recognized instantly, despite the years that had passed. Orgloom the Bloody-Handed had aged, but not in the way humans did. His once jet-black hair had faded to a stark white, and his heavily scarred back and shoulders were a contoured map of hard years. Yet his massive frame and piercing eyes still commanded authority. A massive great axe rested against the sofa, just out of arm's reach. Even seated, he radiated the coiled tension of a predator. The guard approached and gave a respectful nod. War Chief, we've got visitors. This one says he's from White March. Name's Marius. The other one, some kind of elf lady, maybe. Well, she turned into an eagle. They say they want to talk. Orgloom seemed vaguely annoyed, but he turned around slowly to look over his guests. At 6'4", Marius was used to standing head and shoulders over Taldan humans, and at first Orgloom stood at eye level. But getting a closer look at Marius, he corrected his stooped posture, and when he did so, Marius could see Orgloom was almost a giant, just shy of 7 feet tall if he had to guess. Orgloom took a moment, and then he laughed, looking at Marius's carefully manicured haircut and his finely groomed handlebar moustache.
"Nice vest," said Orgloom with a chuckle. "Taldor really managed to breed all the orc right out of you, didn't it?"
Marius thought about Demi's advice, and he was glad that of all the party, she was the one that had accompanied him in here. He felt like doing what he was about to do with Aurelius and Diyanah in the room would have been embarrassing somehow. Some half-orcs had a foot in 2 worlds. Not so much with Marius. He had chosen his path long ago, and it was the human world for him. Still, he had a sense of what was expected of him. Marius puffed up his chest and met Orgloom dead in the eyes, and said, "Not so. I just finished fighting my way through a Rakshasa den. I've brought down manticores, wyverns, and dragons. I'm not exaggerating when I say that 2 days ago I spit in the eye of a demigod. Want to test my orc blood? Go right ahead." Orgloom's eyes burned with fire, and for a brief, terrible moment, Marius thought the giant might go for his axe. But instead, Orgloom laughed.
"You've got a fire in you, boy, and I like it. Tagnor says you're from White March, but you must have been away for a long time."
"That's right," said Marius.
"I've been to Drushvuk once long ago. I was only a boy. You might have met with my father, maybe. His name was Akrod."
Orgloom let out a low chuckle.
"Now I know where your fire comes from. I remember Akrod. He brought his caravan to Drushvuk a time or two. Brave for a Dromar. One of his kinsfolk camps with us here. The rest, I'm sorry to say, were likely all killed or taken."
It had been decades since he'd seen anyone in his family. Still, a wave of worry passed over Marius's face.
"Who is it?"
Marius asked.
"His name is Bogue. We've taken to calling him Bogue Hellbent because of how determined he gets when he puts his mind to something."
"Bogue," said Marius with surprise. "One of my cousins. I've not seen him since we were boys."
"I'll give you time to catch up then, before you are on your way,"
said Orgloom.
"Anyway, what do you want, son of Akrod?"
Before Marius could answer, Demi stepped forward, her tone respectful but firm. "War Chief Orgloom, some of our company needs a safe place to rest. We're traveling with families, women and children, innocents who Pytherius has named enemies of this land. We seek only temporary shelter, and in return we offer information and the possibility of an alliance." Orgloom's gaze flicked to Demi, and he appraised her for a long moment before looking back to Marius.
"An alliance, you say? And what does a handful of refugees have to offer a broken warband like mine?"
"You want vengeance against Pytherius. So do we. Pytherius threatens to destroy Taldor, and you might not think much of it, but it is my adopted home. We've been fighting for Princess Eutropia, and we need every ally we can get." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Orgloom stared at them both, his expression inscrutable. Finally, he leaned back against the couch, his hand drumming against the haft of his axe.
"Taldor's armies pushed our people to the brink of the mountains in antiquity. Yet even that was not enough for you. Why should we help any of you?"
"Because not every Taldan is alike, just as not every orc is alike. I am not from Taldor." The lights under her skin and under her eyes suddenly all glowed, revealing traces of circuitry running all along her body. Orgloom did not know what he was looking at, but it was not a human. "Yet I am permitted in Eutropia's inner circle. Marius is a Dromar from the White Marches, yet he is her trusted champion. We have a Darklands elf in our company as well." Orgloom frowned because he had heard all this drivel before. Marius could see that they were losing him, so he jumped in. "Forget all that. You want Pytherius' blood for what he did to our people. So do I. In a few days' time, our armies will meet in the fields north of the World's Edge Mountains. When Pytherius attacked the orc villages, he outnumbered you 100 to 1. But at this battle, we'll be evenly matched. Join us, and you'll have a real chance to put him and his allies in the ground."
"North of the World's Edge Mountains?"
Orgloom shook his head.
"We cannot cover 100 leagues in that time. My screamers are fast, but not that fast. We could cover 10 leagues in a day at the most. The battle would be long over before we arrive to help." "We're quite resourceful," said Demi. "We may be able to find a way to convey you there magically." Orgulum looked skeptical. "Just for the sake of argument, how many of the Orc and Dromar diaspora are scattered across Sofra and White March right now that would be willing to take up arms and assemble here tomorrow?" Orgulum sighed, as he clearly still felt this was a pointless discussion, but he answered anyway.
"I imagine we could pull together maybe 100 or so warriors, but I'd need a day to put out the call, and most wouldn't get here until tomorrow evening at the earliest."
Demi looked at Marius. "That may be enough time. Aurelius has Panevar's spellbook, and Panevar, just like Hao Jin, knew the gate spell. We could put a gate here and one at the camp in Kriris, and move the orcs from the south of Taldor to the north instantly, and move many more soldiers than would be possible by conventional teleportation." Marius looked at Demi in surprise. She did have a plan after all. He looked back at Orgulum. "If I had the chance to fight by your side, it would make my father very proud." Orgulum raised one last concern.
"And this precious princess of yours, she won't have a problem fighting alongside orc screamers?"
Demi just raised an eyebrow. In Taldor, the lords and ladies often do not lead their armies. In the case of the Grand Princess, the imperial armies are commanded by a Grand Strategos, the High General of the Empire, and it just so happens the Grand Strategos is with us. You can meet him yourself, and you will find he will be more than happy to have orcs and Dromar in his company.
"Very well. Bring me your Grand Strategos. I will put the call out tonight with my best runners. Tomorrow, the orcs of the White Marches assemble for war."
As Orgulum's words settled in the echoing hall, Marius felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned to Demi, his expression one of muted relief. She, however, looked as though she had anticipated this outcome all along. Before they left to collect their friends outside, the war chief leaned forward, his piercing eyes settling on Marius.
"Dromar, just a minute before you go. Just so you know, I place my trust in you, not your foreign friend. If this is a trap, if your princess or your strategos seeks to use my people and discard them, I will not forget. We may bleed for your war, but we are not pawns in it."
"I understand, War Chief. I'll make sure, when this war is over, you will have an audience with our princess. I will request on your behalf that the Taldan Crown pay for the reconstruction of Drushvuk. I cannot promise more than that, but on those two things, you have my word." Orgulum's expression remained unchanged, and yet something shifted in the light of his eyes. Hope, perhaps. They clasped forearms, and then Marius followed Demi out of the room. End of chapter. Hi there, I'm the Mythkeeper. Thank you so much for watching. You've just watched Season 5, Episode 4 of my Pathfinder 616 War for the Crown series. This episode is called The 7 Forms of Sin Monastery, which is the name of the monastery that the Rakshasa use to elevate aspiring humans into the ranks of their immortal circle. Often I've named these episodes after a major encounter in the episode, and although this episode does cover the 7 Forms of Sin Monastery, a large chunk of this episode also takes us back to the Bettanos Keep, where we get some interesting stuff from Marius's backstory as well. I'll go into that in a moment, but first let's start with the 7 Forms of Sin Monastery. Finally, Diyanah is able to find his family, rescue his family. They're being held by the Rakshasa. I decided that I was going to have this be a clean victory, that I thought there'd be more emotional punch if Volto had died in the course of this adventure, and it was just Diyanah and Vespero figuring out what the new normal was like between them. Vespero kind of blames Diyanah for the death of Volto, even though it was obviously Grand Duke Urginus Vabalar who ordered their capture, and then the Rakshasa who actually killed Volto. Vespero kind of blames Diyanah because it is Diana's choice to side with Princess Eutropia that ultimately leads to them being named enemies of the state in the south of the country. So Diyanah and Vespero have a little bit. There's a little bit of friction there. And I thought it would be suitable that the Frascatis work through their friction by going into battle together, and that's how they kind of rebond and they find some kind of equilibrium, and they get maybe a little bit
closer in some ways, and we'll see more of the dynamic between Diyanah and Vespero in some coming episodes as well. So once they'd rescued Vespero's family, or Diyanah's family, they then move on to, they then have to figure out what they're going to do with these civilians that they've essentially rescued. And that's when the idea of returning to Bettanos Keep comes across my players. The nice thing about my playgroup is if I seed things, like I'd had Aurelius mis-teleport to the Bettanos Keep, so now it was part of the canon, they don't forget that I've done that, and that's a great boon for me as a GM. So that was in the back of their heads, and I think when the moment that they had a little more time appeared, they all communally decided this would be a good time to go there. And the other thing that the Bettanos Keep was an opportunity for me to do is to also bring in some of Marius's backstory. Now Marius comes from a prefecture called White March. He's part of kind of a itinerant community of half-orcs that move between some of the more remote parts of Taldor. I knew this adventure would never take us to White March, so I started to think about reasons why some of those half-orcs might end up in Sofra Prefecture instead. And I knew that Pythias' army had come through White March, and also the Grand Duke of White March was pro-Eutropia, which was an interesting sort of dynamic, and I wanted that to shift because I wanted all the south to be under kind of Pythias' sway. And so that's where this whole idea of, well, Pythias attacked the half-orcs, and they ended up in Sofra Prefecture essentially to escape him, and they'd been squatting in Aurelius' father's old tower because it had been abandoned since Pythias had torched it. All of that I think came together really nicely, and then sort of as the leader of the orcs and half-orcs, I created this character that ended up being, I think, a really fun sort of different character for this adventure, we'll see more of that character. That's Orgloom, the Bloody-Handed War Chief of Drushvuk. We'll see more of him over the course of the next couple of episodes. Yeah, this was largely a role-playing episode. A lot of backstory stuff getting uncovered, but a fun one all the same. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you next week.